Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the annual Seniors Math Senior Symposium. We have a lot of interesting talks for you guys tonight. We're going to first start off with a group, our AP seminar students. They're going to present their research. They're going to tell you a little bit about it, and then we're going to go to the other presentations. So I'm going to let them take it away.
Hello, we are ASFA's 2023 AP Seminar Research Team. The three of us are math science students, but we have the pleasure of collaborating with a junior in the Theater Arts Department. We undertook the task of making our own research question under any topic that we wanted, and then using several different lenses to investigate such claims. My name is Sarah Buchanan, and I investigated the political historical lens.
My name is Khalees Benson, and I examine the social cultural lens.
I'm Becker Bargathy, and I research through an economic lens.
And I'm Dexter Gard, and I research the scientific lens.
A New York public school canceled an annual school play so that students had more time for college prep and standardized testing preparation. The schools and classrooms that this affected were kindergarten students. How did we get here, and what can be done?
Let's start by talking about the problems that we're trying to address with our solution.
Discrimination. A 2019 study by the U.S. Department of Education found a correlation between race and ethnicity and standardized testing scores. Additionally, a study by Johns Hopkins University found that a student's demographic information, such as race, sex, gender, and socioeconomic status, had more to do to predict a student's future success than standardized test scores.
Another large problem with standardized testing is the huge cost that comes with it. In a report done by the Brown Center on Education, it was shown that $669 million is spent each year, and this money is spent on primary testing, and is taken from taxpayers and spent on these companies. Additionally, a report done by the Global Newswire showed that $24.9 billion is spent just by American citizens on private tutoring. This is a really concerning statistic.
The next problem that we took a look into was curriculum. As asserted by Public School Review, teachers are now expected to teach to test rather than to focus on what is formerly known as conceptual understanding. Further, in a report in a study done by U.S. News, it is said that standardized tests reduce instructional quality. And Heather Hill, a professor at Harvard University, developed a scale to further investigate. And in schools where instructional quality was rated on a higher rate, standardized tests reduced those scores. And in schools where instructional quality was rated on a lower scale, standardized tests did nothing to improve those scores.
And next, let's discuss test anxiety. These images were generated as part of a study by education scientists Triplett and Barksdale, which had students in elementary schools draw a picture of how they feel about tests. As you can see, these images indicate a high level of test anxiety, and they also represent how I felt when taking the ACT. Additionally, a study by the Texas A&M University found that students who are in disadvantaged populations, such as those in poverty or minority students, have so many long-term stressors at home that they respond to the stress of testing differently. Their brains release more cortisol, which lowers their memory recall and performance by extension. This is a serious problem because it means that these tests are scientifically biased against these disadvantaged students.
What can be done about this?
The first solution that we chose to take a look into was anonymization, and it's simply students taking standardized tests with anonymized data.
So the second solution that we looked at was no testing, which simply means getting rid of standardized testing as a whole.
The third solution we analyzed was portfolios, which is a collection of a student's work throughout their educational journey.
Now, although no testing is a more radical solution, it does have three main cons. The first of which being completely cheap. It completely eliminates the cost of standardized testing. It also eliminates the shame and guilt that comes with testing, and it has no curriculum impact, unlike anonymization.
However, there are some cons. It's opposed by you, the parents, and opposed by administration and stakeholders as well.
Portfolios. So a study by Hamline University actually researched the pros and cons of implementing portfolios rather than standardized testing, and it found that portfolios were able to show a student's progress throughout their educational journey and not just a snapshot of a single day and one test score. It also found that portfolios were able to allow students to represent their understanding in multiple ways, not just bubble sheets, but art.
However, there are some cons to the portfolio's approach. First of all, they're time-consuming. Students can already spend days and days of school on standardized testing and standardized test practice, but these portfolios would require potentially even more work out of students and educators. Additionally, they are very, very expensive. This is because unlike a bubble sheet, which you can feed into a machine and get an answer from, for portfolios, you need a team of trained professionals to grade all of these in time. This can be extremely expensive because these are very difficult to grade. How do you judge how well a student performs on a piece of art, especially a kindergartner? Is it even a good thing to judge that? These questions are very complicated, and training educators in how to answer them and think about these issues could be extremely difficult and expensive.
Let's take a look in anonymization. So it reduces the costs simply due to sending score reports to these stakeholding companies. It eliminates shame and guilt caused by standardized testing, as well as reducing cortisol levels, and it reduces the room for racial bias in standardized tests.
There were some cons, however, and it found that it will still have that impact on curriculum of teachers teaching to the test instead of critical understanding. It was also found that students would have lack of accountability when taking anonymized standardized tests because they could theoretically sleep throughout the entire test and face no consequences.
Despite these issues, we still believe that anonymization is the best solution to these problems. The reason being that all stakeholders in the issue will support anonymization.
Students are relieved because they don't have any shame or guilt, and parents are relieved because it reduces the student's stress.
Additionally, teachers benefit a lot from this approach. A study found that there is a 25 to 35% evaluation error rate when teachers are judged based on standardized tests. What that means is a teacher could be fired just because one year's test was poorly written or because a lot of their students happen to have a bad day. This is a serious issue that would be addressed by anonymization since people wouldn't know which class a student's test score comes from. Additionally, this is one of the most important ones, companies support this solution. As Becker mentioned, there are very large testing companies which have a lot of power over how standardized tests are made and administered. These companies spend lots of money on lobbying, meaning it would be very difficult to get rid of testing or implement portfolios. However, anonymization means that these companies will still be paid for their tests as usual, meaning it will not face resistance from them, which means we can actually do it, which is a very important factor of any solution. Finally, school administration. A report by former school superintendent Joshua Starr described how the real purpose of standardized tests isn't to determine how good a student is or how good a teacher is, it's to determine how well a school is doing and which schools need more support and resources from the state and district level. Now, this is very important because anonymized tests, unlike no testing, can still perform the critical function of school evaluation. This means that this solution will also be supported by administration, which is very important.
There are some limitations to consider, however. The first being, as we mentioned previously, no student accountability. If a student's test data is anonymized and not directly tied to their name, then that reduces the amount of accountability and effort that students will put into standardized tests.
Next, this test method does not evaluate teachers. This is a positive for many reasons, but it does mean that school faculty will have to find a new way to determine how well a teacher is doing. This could cost time and resources that many schools are in desperate need of and could be a serious issue.
It also affects the curriculum. As previously stated, it does not solve this problem.
In conclusion, we believe that anonymization is the best solution to standardized testing because firstly, it is the least disruptive to teachers, students, and businesses alike.
It also addresses the issue of test anxiety and discrimination because students won't feel as much pressure when testing and the graders will not know who did what test. Additionally, it is an objective measure of school performance, which was the original purpose of standardized testing.
Thank you.
I forgot to say, we can take up to 3 questions per presentation, so if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Dr. LeBron?
Would each of you kind of share with us your takeaways from this course and this, specifically this task that you have completed? You still have another one to work on and complete, but this one, will you give us your takeaways, what you've learned, maybe what you would do differently?
So this task was a group presentation, and I feel like this really helped me strengthen a lot of my group and, working with people and making sure that they did their work as well as me doing my work. It was a really helpful learning experience and just, working with other people.
I would say that the biggest thing that I've learned from this course is how to really hone my writing skills. We have a great English program at ASFA, but it's not as focused on the scientific aspect of writing as many of the math science students would be interested in. So having this course to accentuate that and really extend on what we've been learning there has been really great for me.
I think what I've learned so far is one, what was previously mentioned, group working skills. I've definitely learned a lot of those, and basically just group norms that we can all share and be able to be productive. And also, my argumentative skills have been improved because of this course, which I think is really great.
I think something that's really valuable to me about this course is I am an art student, as previously mentioned, so a lot of my courses are heavily influenced by the fine arts, as well as my core classes. It's kind of structured around my fine arts schedule. So I think being able to take this course and really have an eye into some of what math science students do on a daily basis, and to be able to tie that in with a course that has some humanities influence has been really valuable for me. One of my professional goals is to become an attorney, and so argument development as well as presentation and combining those things that I learned in theater, like projection, stage presence, and little techniques that we learn about our voice, and then combining the research and scientific aspect of it has been extremely valuable.
All right, any other questions? We can take 2 more.
Dr. Kinnaman?
So were all of you in agreement then by the end that you all felt that anonymized testing would be best for you yourselves?
Yes, actually, I will say, just because we are students, we personally believe that no testing would be the best solution. We went through kind of how this task works is everyone writes an individual research report, and that is tailored to your specific lens. So as everyone mentioned, Sarah was political historical, I'm social cultural, Becker was economic, and Dexter was scientific. So each of us wrote about standardized tests from those lenses, kind of zoomed in. And so each of us kind of found solutions to our individual problems that we found in our reports. And so I think anonymization was one that we all kind of had enough research on to expound, and it was pretty easy to implement.
We also wanted to make sure that our solution was reasonable. So, like we mentioned, no testing, although we would all enjoy that a lot, it would be extremely impractical, and no schools, parents, or administrations would really be for that.
All right, and we can take 1 more question. Yes, ma'am.
So my question for you is, did you look at how anonymization would affect things such as you want to be an attorney, and in order to be an attorney, you're going to have to take a standardized test that takes over 8 hours. So how does that affect those students who, say, come from a kindergarten to high school? Is there a way to do a combination of anonymization and standardization? Has there been any research on that?
Yes, so anonymization is a form of standardization. So some of the reports that we pulled from Harvard, Stanford, those types of universities that do a lot of educational research. So the reason one of the test data reports that we pulled was because this is for primary school testing. So things like the ACT, SAT, LSAT, things like that were not taken into consideration. But anonymization is a form of standardized data. It's just not directly tied to a student's identity. So if you take a test and it's more generalized in terms of demographic rather than tied to an individual. Schools, students, administrators are still able to pull those results, just not on an individual basis.
That's definitely a big thing, is that we had to carefully control the scope of our project so we didn't have too much work to do, and as part of that, we're only looking at kindergarten through 8th grade, because anonymization is a great solution for little children who can barely read, but it would sort of defeat the point of the ACT. Now, defeating the point of the ACT might be a good thing, but that's out of the scope of this project.
That would be a great idea for future research, however. Great.
Great.
Hello everyone, my name is Tran, and for my research project, I developed a math model that would investigate an incident of chemical pollution in the Decatur, Alabama region. So these two chemical structures you see behind me belong to the chemicals of perfluorooctanoic acid and perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, also known as PFOA and PFOS respectively. These chemicals are part of a chemical group called forever chemicals, and they're called forever chemicals because their strength allows them to resist breaking down in the environment for long periods of time. Additionally, because of their strength, a lot of companies like to apply PFOA and PFOS onto their products to make them water, heat, or oil resistant. However, that becomes a problem when certain industries like 3M improperly dispose of these forever chemicals into the environment. So, for many years, this 3M plant in Decatur would dispose of PFOA and PFOS in the Tennessee River, and that contaminated water would flow downstream 13 miles to be collected by the West Morgan East Lawrence Water Authority, which serves as a primary drinking water source for those of Limestone, Lawrence, and Morgan County. So the objective of my math models were to predict the concentrations of PFOA and PFOS in the Tennessee River, the Water Authority, and in the serum, or blood level, of North Alabama residents with respect to time. How I went about doing so can be seen here. So first, we just start off with the real-world problem, which is the 3M pollution. And then we enter the math world by creating a set of assumptions. These assumptions will simplify the real-world problem, but also make it easier to solve. For example, some of my assumptions were that the North Alabama residents would drink a consistent amount of water every single day and every day a year. Another assumption was that while the water was traveling downstream the Tennessee River, it wouldn't penetrate into groundwater or it wouldn't evaporate into the atmosphere. After I create enough assumptions that will simplify my problem, I can then create a set of governing equations that can explain the dynamics of my math problem, which is in here. For my governing equations, I decided to create a system of differential equations because differential equations are all about rates. And these equations represent the rate at which the amount of chemical changes in, number one, the Tennessee River, the Water Authority, and in the serum level of the North Alabama residents. And all three of these equations are derived from the top equation, which essentially states that the net amount of pollutant is equivalent to the rate of pollutant entering minus the rate of pollutant leaving the system. So with these three governing equations, I can then solve my math model. How I solve my math model can be seen by this. First, this is my input, RMCM, and that stands for the rate and concentration of the 3M discharge that would go into the Tennessee River. I would input that into a simulation I made using a programming language called Octave. This Octave simulation would take these RMCM values, which were provided by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management for every quarter of a year. It would solve these three equations and then output a value of A sub t, A sub w, and A sub p for every quarter of a year. I then asked the code to plot these values onto a graph so that I could visually see the trend. And then after we solve our math model, we then conduct data validation to see how well our model fits in with the real world data, and then we can interpret our solution and see what implications it has on the real world. So here are my results seen. This first figure simply shows the concentrations of PFOA and PFOS in the Tennessee River with respect to time. And then these two graphs represent the concentrations of PFOA and PFOS in the water authority, this one, and in the serum levels for the North Alabama residents in this graph. And as we can see, for each chemical in these two graphs, there are two lines for each chemical. And that's because I decided to extend my math model by further representing the real world. So in late 2016, the Water Authority installed a filtration system that would filter out PFOA and PFOS and prevent them from entering the water. So that's why, for example, you see in this line, you see a very sharp decrease. That represents what happened with the filter. And this line represents what would happen if there was no filter implemented. Additionally, you'll see the black squares and the black circles. That's the real world data I plotted onto my graph, just so I could see how well it fitted. And then I also conducted data validation by calculating both the mean absolute error and the mean absolute percentage error. And as we see in table 2, I assessed those mean absolute percentage errors. And since none of my math models had a mean absolute percentage error over 50%, then none of them would have an inaccurate forecasting. So my math models present a variety of implications about how human health is impacted through this incident. So firstly, looking back at these two graphs, we see that even when a very efficient filtration system was implemented at the Water Authority, it was 99% efficient. We see that for both chemical graphs, there's a very sharp decrease. However, if we look at the graphs for the serum levels, we see there's a very small and slight decrease. That emphasizes that once these chemicals are in your body, they tend to stay there for very long periods of time. And additionally, it emphasizes to industries how they should be cautious when making decisions on how much to pollute into the environment. Secondly, looking at this graph, it predicts that the current values of the concentrations for PFOA and PFOS in the serum of the North Alabama residents to be significantly higher than the EPA health advisories that were set in 2016 and in 2022. So for my future work, I'd like to apply the same math modeling technique of analyzing rates, volumes, and concentrations to another chemically polluted region. For example, earlier this year in February, there was the East Palestine train derailment incident in Ohio. So we know that a lot of those hazardous chemicals made their way into rivers and streams. So I'd like to also analyze the rate at which those rivers and streams are making their way to public drinking water systems, and at what rate will people consume them if intervention is not taken. Additionally, I'd like to investigate the efficiency of intervention taken elsewhere in the system. For example, if 3M had installed a filtration system that would prevent these chemicals from entering the river, how would that change the dynamics of the graphs? And lastly, I'd like to assess how my model works in the long run by conducting further data validation as new data becomes available. For my acknowledgements, I'd like to thank Dr. George Lytle of the University of Montevallo, Ms. Vinci Legumois, Ms. Chin, the ASFA Math-Science Department, and my family and friends. And these are my references. Thank you. All right, are there any questions?
What effect do the chemicals have once they're in the bloodstream of these reptiles?
Yeah, so once the forever chemicals increase to a certain rate in the serum levels, they can cause issues, for example, a weaker immune system, higher cholesterol levels, and an increased risk of kidney and testicular cancer.
Stephen, how did you get your blood serum levels, and how were the chemicals measured in them?
Yeah, so those values were, I got these values from residential exposure investigations. So an organization of the CDC would create a team, and then they would go into the population of the affected counties, and then they would find out who's eligible for blood testing, and then, like for example, if you have blood issues and you can't be tested, or if you're a pregnant mother, they wouldn't want you to be tested. And then they take a blood test, find how much PFOA and PFOS you had in there, and then take the average of the whole community.
So this was measured over what kind of a period of time?
They did it for the 2 years of 2010 and 2016.
Okay.
Aaron.
You mentioned you use data validation on your model, but where did you get this data from? Since you use all your data from the website you mentioned?
Yeah. So that data was used for my simulation. So those values from the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, those numbers were used to create these lines. And then for the black numbers, so for this graph, the Water Authority graph, I got those numbers from another investigation that they produced. They said, okay, here's when we tested, and here's what those values we got when we tested. And for these values, I also got them from residential exposure investigations. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Schaeffer, and I'll be presenting my project on analyzing E. coli concentration for Elder Street, which is located along Shades Creek. So first, I would like to introduce you to Shades Creek. Shades Creek is classified as under the recreational use under the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, meaning during the time this investigation was taking place, the mean E. coli concentration should be equal to or less than 298 E. coli colonies per 100 milliliters. So why is this important, you might ask? Well, Elder Street is a very easy to access place. It's very lovely. It has a little bench for nature viewing, and almost every single time I went there, there was somebody in the creek. So there's a blue little line right there, which indicates Shades Creek. At the very bottom, in a highlighted blue pin, it's Elder Street where we were looking for, and the creek flows from up here to down there. So my hypothesis going into it was that we would be able to find a point source for the high E. coli concentration for Elder Street along the main part of the Shades Creek. So this is an overview of my methods. Going into it, my plan was to have a set range and then increase it or decrease it based on what we saw in the. So let's go a little more in depth to it. I think I need just this. Okay. So this is area 1, and we had Elder Street being 0.0 meters, and then we had a different site about 1 meter up, and then another site about 2 meters up. So for each site, we would take a water sample, and for each water sample, we would then plate it with something called color scan, which would highlight the E. coli concentration. From that, You would let it incubate for about 24 hours and let it refrigerate for about 24 hours, and then both me and someone else would count the E. coli colonies and estimate it out of 100 milliliters. From that, we then did a ANOVA test once we started to recognize the pattern, and if the E. coli, if one site was significantly lower, like 2 kilometers was here, we would disregard the location. So in this image right here, you can see a plated sample of the E. coli. This is from the point source later on in the investigation, and if you look right below it, there's a little purple blue dot, and so the reason I had me and someone else count it was because there were many colonies that were on the fence, either by color or by size. So moving on to area 2, so Elder Street had 2 main inputs, which you can see right here. One is right here, another one is right here. So we wanted to see which input was giving the high E. coli. We were able to find that was a part of the main part of the creek, and we then moved on to area 3, which is highlighted over here in green pins along with a red pin. One thing I'd like to point out is right here is a mobile home site, which is then connected to a tributary where the point source is found, which is indicated in the red pin. So how I analyzed my data was in areas. So area 1 was again was the one that was Elder Street, the 1 kilometer and the 2 kilometer. Area 2 was the 2 points down at Elder Street, and then the third area was the remaining points. So on the top table, you can see a summary of the ANOVA test we did, summarized in the table. And then on the table below it, you see sites listed in pairs based on significance and based on the area. So you can see 0 and 1 kilometer were not significant from each other, but they were significantly different from 2 kilometers overall. So I have the sites all highlighted on the map in blue on the side, and then I have a bar graph representing the mean E. coli colonies per 100 milliliters. So one thing I'd like to point out is the red dotted line is the 298 requirement for it, so it should be equal or less than that. The bars on the bar graph represent the standard error for each site, and the letters represent significant difference based on ANOVA test. So we have the same setup here. The 120 meter is the input coming from the main part of the creek, and the 110 meter point was the input coming from underneath the bridge. So this is area 3. One thing I'd like to point out is that the 0 meter mark here is the point source, which is indicated in the red pinpoint over on the side. So everything was taken in measurements from that. So upstream 900 meters and 100 meters, and downstream 900 and 100 meters from the point source. And it's almost significantly different than almost all of the other sites in the area. So what can we conclude about this? We can conclude that there was a point source for the high E. coli concentration. It was along the main part of the creek, and we know this because the 120 meter input was significantly higher. We also know that it was the point source because that point was significantly higher than those upstream of it in the area. So for future work, I'd like to look at different water characteristics throughout the whole investigation. We looked at it a little bit in the beginning, but we didn't continue all the way through. Another thing I would like to look at is because for this project I had to do a bunch of background research, and I found that a lot of people were looking at the Birmingham area for flooding vulnerability and different water characteristics, so I would want to do that with Shades Creek. Finally, I would like to thank my faculty advisor, Ms. Chin. I would like to thank my mentor, Dr. Dobbins from Stanford University, and I'd like to thank my family. Any questions?
How did you handle the E. coli? You just you have gloves or something?
Yeah, we had gloves, and then every time we would just wash our hands, and we'd have face protection on and eyewear, so it was handled properly. Anyone? Okay.
Does this work? Let's see. I guess it works. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Gates Arnold, and this is my project, Storage Reduction for Interactive Ray Tracing. Ray tracing is expensive and can be time-consuming. Well, you're probably wondering, what is ray tracing, first off? Well, ray tracing is a process, a technique to create 2D images of a 3D world. So it involves tracking light as it would be predicted in reality. So as you can see here in this image, there's a light source right here. And this floor seems to be the same color, a gray, I could say. And what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to calculate the light intensity for a pixel. So right here, this pixel right here is going to be very intense for a light intensity, while right here it would not be that much for light intensity because of it's hitting it right here and hitting it right there. And it is expensive and time consuming because, well, it is expensive because, well, it takes time. And that is because it goes pixel by pixel. So it'll have to do this pixel here, and it'll have to keep on going on until it outputs the entire image rather than as the rays as a whole. And interactive ray tracing is ray tracing done in real time, and it delivers higher quality rendering than pre-rendered ray tracing. And pre-rendered ray tracing is just ray tracing pre-rendered because of how expensive and time-consuming it is. But it also has problems because it uses a lot more storage and a lot more memory. So what were my goals? Well, I wanted to develop 2 codes. The first code, termed the old code, was a code based off of Peter Shirley's book, Ray Tracing in 1 Weekend. And that was to use basic concepts discussed in the book in C++. And the second code was for a new code, which was done in Peter Shirley's book, Ray Tracing the Next Week. And it was supposed to reduce the storage overhead, reduce runtime, et cetera, for advanced concepts. And I wanted to compare the 2 developed codes to find if there was a statistically significant difference in runtimes for multiple cases. So what does a ray tracer need? Well, it needs vector classes for 3D coordinates. It needs to see how far is it this way, how far is it that way, how far up is it. It needs a ray class to track the rays of light as they go. So from this point right here to source and onwards. It needs a sphere class because, well, spheres are the easiest shape to do this on for a 3D world. It's just one radius like this, spread out. There also needs collision classes to see, oh, this ray hit the sphere or not. It also needs material classes because there's more materials than just matte stuff, such as this black theater floor. It needs metals and dielectrics. And it also needs a camera class to be able to view it. And right here's the camera class. This is the interaction class, and this is showing the reflection. And what is added to an advanced ray tracer? More stuff. Texture classes. So texture classes involve adding more textures than just the materials. So you have this noise texture right here. I want to add noise to my sphere, do I? Yes, I do. So yeah, I want to add noise to it. Or I can also add an image texture of this. So if I want to put an image of the Earth on top of the sphere, I can do that. Also do a light class so that I'd be able to do light sources. So if I want to say, hey, I want to make a sun rather than just a blue sky, well, I'm able to make a sun, I guess, an artificial one. Bounding volume hierarchy and the axis aligned bounding box from the BVH and the ABB classes. What those are intended to do, the BVH, first of all, is supposed to, within a select area and there's a number of objects, You want to see whether a ray hits that area or not. And you're going to subdivide it into smaller boxes until it's a box covering each tiny object. And if it doesn't hit the box, do not calculate it. It's junk. It's not necessary to do. Same thing with the axis line bounding box, or the AABB, because it's going to see, does this ray happen within an X interval or in a Y interval at the same time? If it doesn't hit it, disregard it. Don't calculate it. It's not necessary to do. And finally, a rectangle class is to be added because there's more shapes than spheres, of course. And this is the bounding volume hierarchy, and this is the AABB. And here's some outputted images. So you may see there's different types of textures here. This is a noise texture. This is a light texture. This is a matte texture. This is glass/dielectric texture, and yellow metal sphere. But you see that all these vary in their colors as well as their textures. And I wanted to test this for multiple cases. And multiple cases varied in the number of objects, such as here, depended on the color of the object. So right here, this is red, this is purple. It also depends on camera position from above, because this is being viewed from above, this isn't. And it also focuses on fuzziness, too. This is very fuzzy, same as that, but fuzzy. So my hypothesis. My hypothesis that I had was that the null hypothesis was that the new code and the old code means for runtime were equal to each other. However, my alternative hypothesis was that those means were not equal to each other. And each case had 30 trials run in each version of the code. They were all outputted in the same resolution, 1,000 to 500, and the runtime for the codes to create the image of the case was recorded. So the code snippet's right here. So this is the old code, and this is the new code. They have the same function, but you can see that in the new code it seems a little larger. And my result's right here. You might not understand what it means, and I will point it out. So right here for case 1 and case 3, 4, and 6. The p-values for that are all less than 0.05, so you look at that. So for cases 2 and 5, well, the p-values were more than the significance level, which meant that the null hypothesis could not be rejected, which would mean that for those cases of 2 and 5, that the means were equal to each other. However, for cases 1, 3, 4, and 6, because they're less than 0.05, that means we can reject the null hypothesis and say, oh, there is a difference between the means of the runtimes for the code. And so for cases 1, 4, and 6, they're not all alike. Because here, the mean runtimes for the old code, it ran faster than the mean runtimes for the new code. And for case 3 right here, and also the mean runtime ran faster for the new code than the mean runtime for the old code. And discussion. Why did this happen? Why did it seem that 3 cases of this seem to say the old code ran faster? Is it my fault? Probably. But the new code probably had more cluttering than the old code. You may have saw on that last slide, not the last slide, but on the one of the previous slides, that there were those code snippets of the old code and the new code, and they both do the same function, but there's a lot more to it, a lot more functions, a lot more calls to be made that don't do anything at all. And the new code may have been slower as well because of RAM limitations. I did this on Replit, and Replit has RAM limitations, probably severely limited it. I think it did. But future work, I felt like I would reduce the storage overhead needed to create the image. I'd also like to reduce image size and resolution to help with reducing runtime, because that means there's less pixels involved, which would mean that there's less calculation needed between to calculate for the pixels. I'd also like to use the full extent of the new code that was severely limited because there was the addition of textures and noise and the image ones and the light because, well, it's not on the old code. And I would also like to definitely improve the AABB and the BVH functions for the code. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Kumar, my mentor at UAB. I'd like to acknowledge Ms. Chin at ASFA, who is my faculty advisor. Dr. Fornelay for helping me out with the results and the statistics. My family, my friends, and ASFA. And these are my references. You in the back?
Yes. So I was wondering, did you notice what was the difference between case 1, 3, 4, 5, where the mean was significantly low, and the cases where they were, say, 3 and 5? What was the difference between the cases themselves, like the images?
Oh, I can show. Well, for cases 1, case 3, 4, and 6. Well, they differ in the number of objects on the screen. It also varies because there's the camera position being viewed above. Because case 3 is kind of like case 1, but it's being viewed from above and at an angle from above. Case 4 differs because it's being viewed from above, but it's a purple sphere, only just a purple sphere. And case 6 varies because it's being viewed from above, but it has a greater aperture and a greater field of view than, say, for case 5. So it seems more fuzzier and it seems more closer than it should be, even though it's at the same position as it is.
So would you say that it was also the cases that affected the runtime and not just the code overhead or the extra?
I guess I would say probably the cases did affect it because I had to compare between the two codes, and I wasn't able to use the image textures or the noise textures or the light textures for it, of course.
Thank you.
All right. I don't see any other questions. Oh, never mind. Yeah.
What's the purpose of this?
What's the purpose of this? Well, you ever seen those Pixar movies or whatever?
Yes.
Well, so Pixar movies, they're done for ray tracing because that all CGI is done for ray tracing, and so what I was trying to intend for that, it wasn't necessarily due for like Pixar, because all that Pixar stuff is like being pre-rendered. It's being done on like massive servers that are probably like bigger than this entire theater. And I felt like doing it for graphics because it would make, you'd be able to generate stuff on the fly without it like affecting like frames per second. It wouldn't affect like memory or storage for it. And I kind of want to get into computer science. Yeah, that's what.
Hello, my name is Joscelyn Peterson, and I study the effects of environmental disparities on the environmental awareness of high school students in the greater Birmingham area. So just for some background, the EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment of all people with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So research shows that environmental injustice can have dire effects on those living in low-income, predominantly African-American neighborhoods. Because of this, the demographics of several neighborhoods in the greater Birmingham area make its residents vulnerable to facing environmental disparities due to this injustice. So what is an environmental disparity? It can look like different things. An example is this image right here. As you can see, there's a neighborhood playground, and right nearby, there's some type of heavy industry plant polluting the air. So this could cause respiratory issues for anyone in that area. Another example is the Flint water crisis. This is an image of the water in Flint, Michigan. And the Flint water crisis gained national attention in 2014 after children in the area were found to have lead poisoning due to drinking from this contaminated water supply. So here's an example. These are environmental justice screen maps of the Ensign neighborhood located in Birmingham. As you can see, this neighborhood is in the 95th to 100th percentile for low-income households and also for households with people of color. So this means that the residents in this neighborhood are very susceptible to facing environmental disparities. So what my project aims to do is to study two kind of questions. First, are students in these vulnerable areas even aware of the disparities they may be facing? And how can facing environmental disparities have an impact on student perceptions or ideas about other environmental issues? I hypothesized that students experiencing environmental disparities would have a low environmental awareness. So to start off my project, I selected two areas to study. Jackson Olin High School is in the previously mentioned Inslee neighborhood, and about 14 miles northeast of Jackson Olin is Huffman High School. These two schools were selected based on their shared demographics of having a population of predominantly African American students from low-income households. After I selected areas, I began a plan to assess the awareness of students. Previous research has been done on assessing student awareness using quantitative survey models. However, by using a qualitative approach, such as the focus group diagram shown in this image, I'd be able to receive verbal content data from every participant as opposed to just having a numerical summary of my findings. So this is the diagram that I used to survey students from both schools. Once I was in the focus groups, I had a moderator guide made up of a set list of questions designed to assess students' knowledge on these topics shown. So during the focus group discussions, they were about an hour long each, I recorded the conversation using this digital audio recorder. And after I had those audio files downloaded, I created a transcript of the files, and then I began to analyze my transcript by marking each student response with a specific type of code in order to pull out key themes. So for my purposes, the themes were U, A, and SK. U standing for a response indicating an unawareness of the concepts being asked. This would be answers like no, I don't know, or no answer at all. A being a response that indicated a basic awareness of concepts. So this was basic answers such as yes or I'm sure, but I'm not totally aware. Answers like that. And then SK meaning a response that indicated a depth of knowledge. So this would be responses that gave examples or really expanded on what the students knew. And this is a method of analysis known as constant comparison analysis. So figure 1 shows the results of this analysis. In order to maintain anonymity, each student was given an identifier. So HP stands for Huffman High School participants, and JP stands for Jackson Olin High School participants. As you can see, the majority of responses for each student were marked as U, and so that means that students were generally unaware of the environmental concepts that I was asking them. I also found that the type of disparities that students described was connected to their ideas about environmental protection. So in figure 2 shows the examples from students from Jackson Olin High School. An example of a disparity they described was secondhand smoke causing respiratory issues. In return, when I asked students about ways that they can protect their environment, an example that they came up with was mental health outreach programs in order to prevent smoking. And a similar trend occurred for Huffman High School students. An example of the disparity they described was smoke from a nearby landfill fire causing an exacerbation of asthma symptoms. And then when I asked about environmental protection, ideas that they came up with were for testing heavy industry plants and asking for better pollution regulation policies. So in conclusion, just over 57% of the average type of responses were coded as U, meaning that the majority of students experiencing environmental disparities in my focus groups were unaware of the environmental questions that I was asking them, thus supporting my hypothesis. So student participant JP2 sums up the importance of this finding perfectly by saying if nobody knows what's going on, then nobody's going to think there's a problem that needs to be fixed. So if students continue to exhibit unawareness, as they did in my project, then the cycle of injustice is bound to continue. Also, additionally, the type of disparity that students describe was connected to their ideas about environmental protection. And this is important because it shows that even though students weren't totally aware of the disparities they were facing, it still had an impact on their perceptions or ideas about other environmental issues. Furthermore, I found that many students experiencing environmental disparities believed that the most effective way to receive environmental education was through conversations with environmental justice advocates, through community involvement, or through social media efforts. And this proposes a solution for the lack of awareness that they exhibited in my focus group. In the future, I would love to have multiple focus groups at each school, just in order to increase my sample size and really solidify my findings. I would also like to have focus group discussions in areas that are of higher income or in predominantly white areas in order to add a comparison aspect to my project, just because now that I know that students experiencing environmental disparities have a low environmental awareness, I would love to see if that differs with students who aren't experiencing environmental disparities. I would also love to have focus group discussions in schools that are in the North Birmingham area. North Birmingham is a region that is historically known to have facing heavy industry pollution, so I would love to expand my knowledge on that area. Here's an example of the heavy industry located in the North Birmingham area. For my acknowledgments, I would love to thank my mentor, Dr. Shantice Allen of UAB, my faculty advisors, Ms. Chin and Dr. Fenoy, and a special thanks to Michael Harris and Frank Willis from Huffman High School and Jackson Olin High School, respectively, for allowing me to have discussions with students from their schools. And I would also like to thank my friends and my family for supporting me throughout this process. Thank you. Any questions? Okay. So what me and my mentor did was we sent an email to the principal or the teacher that we had contact with at each schools, and they for a teacher, it was a specific class that he gave. He was offering extra bonus points for participating in the focus group, or the principal just selected students that he knew of who were available to do the focus group. So that was our recruitment process. Yes, ma'am?
Among students who said that they were unaware about EJ issues in their area, what proportion of those students contributed to ways of combating or learning more about those issues?
I'll go back to okay, so during the focus group, during the focus group, there were a lot of students who didn't answer questions, so that's a way that I took as that they were unaware. But for the students who did answer, they gave a lot of feedback on how to have better environmental education. As I mentioned in the conclusion slide, there was pretty much a group consensus within the focus groups that students wanted more community involvement and social media efforts and conversations with environmental justice advocates. These were the examples that the group had a consensus of.
So basically, as the conversation continued, the students who were unaware became more involved and wanted to.
Yes, their minds opened up to more ideas about ways that they could fix the problem of not being aware. Thank you. Anything else? No? Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Okay, so my name is Daniel Zhao. My project is optimal tracking of moving aerial targets with online reinforcement learning. So let's break that down. So what is a moving aerial target? So a moving aerial target, especially in like a military application, would be like an enemy missile, an enemy aircraft, nowadays even like an enemy drone. And what we want to do is we want to use our own rockets, our own missiles to actually like go up and like shoot these down because we just try to eliminate the threat before it gets to us. So we're basically trying to do air defense. So why does this matter? So in the past couple of months, the United States military has actually shot down 4 unidentified flying objects in North America. And the pilots flying these missions have actually described them as moving very erratically or unpredictably. And some of them have even described them as like emitting signals that are interfering with their own instruments. So every time we actually go and shoot something down from the air, it's actually $500,000, right? Each of those missiles are $500,000, and that's not even counting the money that it takes for like fuel and maintenance to send these planes to the sky. So that's really expensive. So why does it matter if it's really expensive? So this is an assumption we make, that military applications are about ratios and not absolute numbers. So you can kind of think about this kind of like, let's say drugs or medicine. So let's say you're creating a new drug to solve this like disease or whatever. It doesn't matter if it, let's say, has really high efficacy. It has to be affordable so you can make more of that drug to affect more people. So it's the same with missiles. So it's not about the most powerful weapon, it's about how you can make a weapon that's economical so you can just make more of them, right? So another problem is cyber physical attacks. So what an enemy can do is they can basically send an interference signal or an interference radio that actually takes, like, let's say your sensor data read something like this. You could get a very noisy data set like this. And this is really bad because since you're creating calculations every single second, this could lead to mission failure. So you can kind of think of it like if you're in a class and you're listening to a professor, right? They're doing a lecture, they're doing whatever on the board, right? But the person next to you is like screaming or singing like a really loud song or whatever. Even though the information is technically all there on the board, you may be distracted because there's other stuff going on. So it's kind of like the same thing. So what I actually did is I designed an artificial intelligence system, and this is because it employs something called neural networks. And neural networks are known to be very adaptable to these like noise and small interferences, and they're very good at adapting to unpredictable outputs, so nonlinear trajectories. And another benefit of this is they can be run on really tiny computer chips. So as I said before, it's not about making the most powerful weapon, it's about making the most economical one. So these tiny computer chips, they're really cheap, you can just put them in there, and they're really inexpensive. So our engineering goal was to develop a MATLAB simulation to model something called a Dubin's vehicle. So a Dubin's vehicle is basically a robotic car model where you move at a constant velocity, and the only control that you have is that it can swivel, so you can rotate, but you have to keep moving. So this is realistic to model aerial things because let's say you have a plane, right? A plane has to keep moving horizontally because if it just stops moving, it falls out of the sky and it ruins the whole point. So the Dubin's vehicle is a really realistic way to model aircraft. So these are just equations, so these are just dynamics that represent how the Dubin's vehicle runs. So another assumption that we make is that enemies are bad and they will act in very bad ways. So what this means is, let's say you're tracking an enemy target, so an enemy aircraft. You can't really expect this enemy aircraft to come right into your hands, right? So it's kind of like a chess game. If you're playing a chess game, you have to take actions to predict what the opponent will do. Like the opponent's not going to just fall into your trap. So that's what we have to assume. So I actually designed a game theory method, so it's called a pursuer-evader game. So this is basically kind of like a cat and mouse game. So we have our own missile, which is the pursuer, and then the enemy aircraft is the evader, so it's obviously trying to evade us, right? But what makes this really powerful is that this is actually not a perfect information game. So we know nothing about the physics or the dynamics of the enemy aircraft. We don't know if it runs like a helicopter or an airplane or a drone. We don't know. The AI has to figure it out by itself. And we do this by trying to stabilize this error function. So S is the state of our aircraft, and then S target is the state of the enemy aircraft. So once this is 0, that means we're basically on the aircraft. So we hit the aircraft. So that's what we want. So how do we do this? So traditionally, using like AI or neural networks, you would have a training set, and then you would just design an algorithm to tune the weights to model that training set, so to copy that training set. But in like missile defense, this training set really doesn't exist, right? There's not a data set to taking down a missile. That's not a thing. So what we do is something called online reinforcement learning. So what is online learning? So as I said before, where you can see all the data at once and train on it, that's offline learning. Online learning is when the training set is the testing set. So after you train, you have to immediately make an action. So you're doing it continuously, so learning on the fly, basically. And we do this with reinforcement learning. So reinforcement learning is basically, it's kind of like training a dog. When they do something that we want, we give it a reward. When it does something we doesn't, we just give it a penalty, right? So we actually give it a reward for coming close to the target, because that's what we want, it to come close, so we give it a reward for that. But we give it a penalty for using any type of energy, any type of control. So this could model like fuel or energy, because in the real world, fuel is limited. And if you just run out of fuel, you fall out of the sky, so there's no point in doing the problem. So this is represented by a little cost function here. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to find the minimum U is control. We're trying to find that to minimize the entire cost function. So this value V is the value function, so it's kind of like the rules of the game. And this is the optimal solution. Like this is the 100% optimal way to do this. However, the problem is that you can't really solve this, like at all. So what you need to do is you need to do what we did before and using the neural networks to approximate it as best as we can. So that's our goal. So this is my training loop for my simulation. So first, as I said before, you have no idea of any physics or the dynamics of the enemy. So you basically just do random actions. So you let it run and explore the state, and then you observe and collect data from sensors. So what this would be is basically the error or the difference between where you are right now and then where you want to be. So the coordinates, the difference between you and the target. And this actually gets sent to something called an actor-critic neural network structure. So a good way to explain actor-critic neural networks is it's kind of like a self-driving car. So like if you have a Tesla, you may know this. If you have a Tesla, what they do is they take in sensor data, so they take in like camera data. So you have a bunch of images, a bunch of pixels, and from those pixels, you can predict that there's a stop sign in front of you, right? But you don't know what to do at the stop sign. So the critic network says, based on these pixels, we see a stop sign. But the actor network says, because we see a stop sign, we have to press the brakes. So they kind of work together. The actor is more to do with like the actions or the controls, the things you're actually doing. So they work together to guide my little plane or a missile. So here is a little video of my simulation. So you can see the purple here. The purple here actually represents our actors, or our pursuer, and then the red is the enemy aircraft. So at first you can see it's kind of like loitering around and not really doing anything. But what it's actually doing, since it starts with absolutely zero knowledge about anything, it's just tuning the weights. So when it does come back around, it's able to hit it 3 times. So I'll let it play again. So you can see first, it's kind of like just spinning in a circle here. And then this first hit is kind of like a coincidence, but then it kind of like leaves the orbit. And I really like this last one because it like changes directions. It's pretty cool. So this is the weight of our actor and critic neural networks. And all we really need to see here is that they both converge. And this is really important because once your weights converge, you know that you did learn a solution. However, we don't know that this is an optimal solution or the solution is any good except by looking at the trajectories like we did before. But we did see that we were able to learn something through our neural networks. So as I said before, our simulation did demonstrate that it can perform like a search and destroy mission. In a matter of 15 seconds, it was able to hit the enemy at 3 different points. And then based on our weight analysis, we can see that there was 3 major learning sections sections in our simulation where our actor was actually learning. And this is good because we can use this to find new simulations or new trajectories where our actor can learn the most from. So for further impacts, this can actually be applied to things outside the military. So if you've seen a bunch of wildfires out here, right? So since the physics are not known and they're adapting to any type of physics, we can basically adapt to any unpredictable moving target. And wildfires, they move in very unpredictable ways. So let's say you had a firefighting drone with water or chemicals. You could basically take observations of the movement of this wildfire to have an optimal way to put out all the fire or something like that. So it's the same algorithm. So for future work, we could do something called implement a bounded rationality model. So what a bounded rationality model is if you've ever heard of the chess AIs and how they work. So first, they just train them to learn all the basic rules, like the pawn goes 2 squares or whatever, right? And then they actually play each other. So the winner of that game would be a better AI, and they just keep doing this over and over and over again to create a better and better one. So what we can do is we can have 2 of these aircraft try to track each other. And then the winner of this game would be a better AI, would be a better tracker, and we could just keep doing this over and over again, the same way. So I'd like to acknowledge my advisor, Dr. Flanoy, and then my mentor, Dr. Ramvadakis from Georgia Tech, and then Dr. Yohoya, Ms. Lagema, and Ms. Chen for helping me all these years, and then my family and friends, of course.
My name is Sahana Donti, and I studied the parent and peer influence on youth civic engagement during COVID-19 with relative effects of 5 different demographic variables. So civic engagement is a powerful tool that helps make a positive change in the community, and it helps youth with social, academic, and leadership qualities. So past research has shown that opportunity and personality are the 2 main factors that affect civic engagement in youth. And I'm going to be looking at other factors that might be affecting this. So this data was taking place during COVID-19, which was a pretty historic time. There were widespread school closures and a lot of health concerns, which would have likely prompted youth to get active in their community. So my first objective is to look at 5 demographic variables in relation to civic engagement and civic competence and see how the demographic variables affect this. So my demographic variables are sex, parental education, race, school online status, and geographic rurality. And my second objective is to look at the joint and independent influence of relationship with parents and peers on the civic engagement. So this is a breakdown of my participants. I had a total of 284 participants. And the reason why I could only have Caucasian and African American participants is because this survey was handed out in rural parts of Alabama where we were not able to get a diverse participant list. So we recruited people through social media and advertising, and interested people were sent a consent link. And upon completion, which was a pretty extensive survey based on analytical-based questions, they received a small stipend to motivate them. So in this survey, I had 5 different measures, and these are each measure had a set of questions that went along with it. So my first measure is youth perceived civic competence. So the perceptions of the participant and how effective they had in the knowledge in their community, and also influencing others in their community without physical involvement. So youth civic engagement is the actual physical involvement through school, national, and community services. And then I had closest to parents, which is what kind of relationship the participants had with their parents, whether they were close or not with them, and most importantly, if their parents influenced the participants. And same thing with closest to peers, how many friends the participants had and the relationship with them, and how likely they are to influence each other. So, and then the demographics. So school modality, if they were online or face-to-face during COVID-19, child sex, child race, Caucasian or African American, parental education, which is the parent's highest degree of education, and household rurality or isolation. So these 3 specific measures needed to be calculated through a basis of questions. So a reliability score was calculated to verify the participants' answers. So this score is basically telling us the variance between each participant's answers. So less variation is a higher reliability score. And these are pretty high reliability scores. So this is telling me that I can trust my participants' answers and use them in my analysis. So in Table 1 and Table 2, I calculated a regressional analysis through the demographic variables in relation to civic competence and civic engagement. So in Table 1, it's a lot of numbers, but all you have to pay attention to is the significant values. So since all those numbers are above 0.05, then I can say that they're not significant. And same thing with Table 2, except these numbers are correlation coefficients. So the closer these numbers are to 1 and -1 is that they have some kind of relationship between the variables. However, these numbers are pretty close to 0, so I can assume no correlation. So to summarize these two tables, demographics played no role in civic engagement and civic competence. So I actually found this very surprising because past research has shown higher household rurality or isolation indicate less opportunity for the participants, so they're going to be typically less engaged, and girls are typically more engaged than boys. However, my study did not show this. And in Table 3 and Table 4, these are 2 stepwise linear regressional models. So since in Table 1 and Table 2 we control for the demographic variables, I can now look at the parent closeness and peer closeness. So these values are significant, and then I look at the B, which is basically slope, and these are both positive and increasing. So this tells me that there's a linear relationship between them. And then beta is a special case of correlation coefficient, and yes, these numbers are not completely close to 1. However, they do indicate some kind of correlation. And it should be noted that parent closeness have a higher B value and higher beta value, so this is telling me parents play more of a role than peers on civic competence. And in Table 4, I also controlled for civic competence. And the red shows that perceived civic competence and peer closeness are the only 2 values that are significant in affecting civic engagement. So, consistent with research during non-historical times, so before COVID-19, participants who were closer with their parents are typically more confident in their community. And I think this is because parents serve as a primary role model in this participants' lives and install confidence in their lives. And also, children with good relationships with their friends are more likely to be civically engaged in their community. And I think this is because friends inspire one another to get active in their community. So yeah, it should be noted that this was taking place during COVID-19, so any capable age student knew the hardships going on, and even if they were not civically engaged before COVID-19, might have been more civically engaged during COVID-19. So for future research, I would love to determine specific parenting styles that affect civic engagement. Like, for example, an authoritative parenting style and how this would affect civic engagement, because we can teach parents how to raise a more civically engaged student, because it's very important. Because if the children start at a civically engaged mentality from a younger age, when they're older, they can vote and then be involved in civic matters. Also, I'd like to determine how friends help one another from being civically competent to actually being civically engaged in the community. So these are two scenarios that I would also like to add analytical-based questions on in the survey, and that be handed out in also city places in Alabama and not just rural parts. So I would like to thank my mentor, Dr. Jeffrey Parker from the University of Alabama, and my advisors, Ms. Thrash and Ms. Chin, and family and friends. Thank you so much. Any questions? Yes.
I was wondering, you might have mentioned it, I didn't hear. What types of questions were they? Were they yes, no, or subjective? Like they have to
Yeah. So, like the three specific measures that I had to calculate a reliability score on, those were like on a scale. There were several questions that were on a scale, and pretty like similar questions, just so we can get a confident answer from the participants. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah.
How did you put together the funding to pay the participants?
Yeah, so this was actually done with the University of Alabama. They completed this data, and they did a similar research to this before COVID-19, so it's significant during COVID-19, so that's why they knew they would do that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So, hello, my name is Debrow, and I'm going to be presenting my project on how to treat dandruff using artificial intelligence. So, oh crap, I forgot the remote. It wasn't me, it was the remote's fault for being there. So as I was saying, I was going to present my project on how to treat dandruff using artificial intelligence. So out of a raise of hands, how many of you have dandruff? So as you can see, dandruff is a very common condition that affects over 50% of the people in the world, namely adults. And what I decided to do, and dandruff has many different psychological effects and health effects as well. So some of the psychological effects of having dandruff is that you may be bullied for having dandruff, you may feel unattractive, and you might want to avoid social situations altogether. And dandruff can also impact your health because it can make your acne worse. Because if the dandruff flakes fall into your skin, it can and make your acne worse. And I have a first-hand account of all of that. And so basically, what I decided to do is target the oil that is involved in creating dandruff. Because dandruff is created when the interactions between the bacteria on your scalp as well as the oil on your scalp as well. But if you target the oil, you'll get rid of the food source of the bacteria as well as the food source itself, which would be which would be killing 2 birds with 1 stone. So how would I do that? Well, this is where the artificial intelligence comes in. So basically what I did is use an artificial intelligence tool to find information about what drugs would be best to be repurposed in a way that can inhibit dandruff as well. And as a result, I found many results that fit this criteria. So as shown here, these are the different components of sebum, that sebum is made out of. So namely fatty acids, triglycerides, and wax diesters. So if I were to target the production of these components, dandruff should stop as well as a result. So basically, everything I did for this project was in silico, and that's just a fancy word for saying everything I did was on the computer. And so really all I needed was my AI tool and just a couple of spreadsheets to catalog all the results that I found. And so what I found using Translator, which is the name of the AI tool that I use, is different genes that are involved in the production of the creation of sebum. And namely, the genes that I found inhibit fatty acids, squalene, and wax diesters. So the first genes that I found are called ACAT1 and ACAT2, and they are involved in fatty acid synthesis, cholesterol synthesis, as well as cholesterol ester synthesis. And the second gene that I found is called FDFT1, which is involved in squalene synthesis. And the last gene I found was called ASPG1, which is involved in wax ester synthesis. So basically, the reason I chose to use Translator is that it's better to use Translator rather than just use like another search engine like Google or PubMed or Yahoo. Because if you use Google, it'll just read one paper, which will try to find an answer based off reading that one paper. But it wouldn't be a good idea to do that. So what Translator did is it reads many different papers to figure out how to find a more conceptual answer, which would be better than treating dandruff altogether. Oops, I forgot that. So basically what I did after I found the genes, after using Translator for the first time, I put those genes back into Translator. And this is just a picture of the hard code that Translator is made out of. But since using the graphic user interface is way easier to use, I decided to do that because the code automatically generates when you use the graphic user interface. And this is just what it looks like, and basically how it works is like a block-based programming language like Scratch or Snap, if you're familiar with those coding languages. So after using the GUI, I found over 500 results as shown right here. And as you can see, only 3 of the AI tools that were used only found results, and the other 3 didn't find anything. But that wasn't a problem since over 500 results were found. So basically, since I can't fit all 500 drugs on here for spacious reasons, I had to truncate my list down into the 10 top most interesting drugs that I thought would be interesting to list. And as you can see, as you may notice, most of these drugs can be found over the counter. So for example, statins. That's a very popular drug people use to regulate the cholesterol. Retinol, that's basically just a concentrated form of vitamin A. You can find it in like beauty products like Revlon, Olay Revlon, to make you feel more prettier. Resveratrol, you can find at a nutrition store. It's also found in different wines and grapes. And I even have melatonin and aspirin on this list because you may have those in your medicine cabinet at home as well. And this is basically just what comes back when I use Translator and as I find the result. And not only does it get back the result, but it shows how it's related to other results that I found as well. So basically what I described to you was a computational approach on how to find different cures for a topic, for a disease in question. And some of the things that I found was that because like everything else in this world, it comes with its benefits and drawbacks. So some of the benefits of this is that it's easier and faster to use rather than just going to a lab and having actual drug trials. And also, the AI brings back everything it found on a specific topic and brings it back to me. However, not all the information that I found would be relevant to what I'm trying to figure out. So for example, one of the things that came back was cocaine, and you probably don't want to use that to treat dandruff as well. I hope. And another thing I found, another thing that was bad for this project was that I wasn't actually able to treat any of the drugs that I found because everything, as I said before, everything was done in silico, which is just a fancy word for saying I did everything on the computer. So what I want to do to work around this in the future is have actual drug trials that test these drugs as well as make the list more, have more drugs to test rather than just having over like 10 drugs. I want to probably expand this list to like 20 or 50, having more, about 20 or 50 drugs more. And also I want to test safe combinations of drugs. So like, I'm going to go back to this slide as an example. So for example, if I use retinol and fig allergenic extract, it would inhibit all the genes that are involved in creating the components of SIBO. But also I would want to test safe combinations because another example would be if you try to like take statins on top of aspirin, you probably die if you do that. So you don't want that. So yes, I would like to thank my mentor, Dr. Andrew Krause, for helping me. I will also want to thank the people at Alabama School of Fine Arts, namely Ms. Chin, Dr. Flournoy, and Mr. Kwong. And lastly, I want to thank God, my family, and my friends. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, Ethan.
What would be the side effects of removing the oil from your scalp?
Well, basically, the oil is used to moisturize some of the parts of your scalp, but dandruff is created when excess oil is made. So basically what I wanted to do, if I was to repurpose the drugs, I would want to inhibit the oil so it would keep some of the oil on your scalp, but so it can moisturize your scalp but not have like an excess so it can treat dandruff effectively. The people in the back, like who was, Emery. Yeah.
Is inhibiting the production of some of those genes like you talked about, does that have effects on body functions other than the production of oil on your scalp? Is that going to have effects on other parts?
Yes, and that would be something I want to deal with in my future work, is to find a way that I can treat these genes without having many adverse side effects. Steven, who are you pointing to?
Yeah.
Oh, the guy that's, yeah, him.
I raised two hands.
Yeah, the guy who just raised his two hands.
So my question is, did you try to find out whether any of the drugs that you have discovered
Can you repeat the question?
Are actually under trial?
No, I wasn't able to like test any of the drugs because everything was on the computer.
No, but the drugs that you have identified in your list, is there any drug that is under trial in FDA?
Oh, no.
Okay, you should do that.
Yeah, I hope to do that. Any other? Yes, Dr. Mitchell.
How do you predict the effectiveness of the drugs would be versus, say, common dandruff solutions like dandruff shampoo and things like that? Or did you look at the ingredients in a dandruff shampoo?
So I did find like one of the things that came up was zinc pyrithione, which is a very common prescribed shampoo that is used. So I wouldn't really want to look at those since it's already tested. So I want to find different things that could be repurposed to treat dandruff, because like I don't think anybody has like repurposed melatonin to treat dandruff before.
Thank you.
Since we're running a little low on time, we're going to only take maximum 2 questions.
All right. Hi, guys. My name is Sanjana Chada, and today I will be talking about how changes in the gut microbiome correlate with low morbidity and mortality post-toxic gas exposure. And the toxic gas that was used in my study was chlorine gas. So what is chlorine gas? Chlorine gas is one of the most commonly manufactured chemicals in the United States, with its main use as a bleach in the manufacturing of paper and cloth. It's also used in pesticides, solvents, and as we all know, swimming pool water and drinking water to kill any harmful bacteria. However, chlorine gas is actually a pulmonary irritant that can cause damage to the upper and lower respiratory tract, where high amounts can cause respiratory failure and lung inflammation. And this figure here shows the different amounts of chlorine gas and the effect on the human body. So for example, anything over 430 parts per million is fatal after 30 minutes. So in addition to the lungs, the gastrointestinal tract can also be exposed to these chemicals, and the gut microbiome is a complex system of microbes that coexist in the gastrointestinal tract that regulate immunological and inflammatory responses. However, the exposure to these dangerous chemicals can disrupt the gut microbiome, causing something called gut dysbiosis, which is known as the imbalance of the gut microbiome, usually related with an unhealthy outcome. So why is chlorine gas dangerous? It's because of the accidents. There have been many accidents that occur when chlorine leaks or spills, pressurized tanks rupture, or train cars derail. For example, there was the Eastern Ohio train derailment where 5 of the cars were carrying vinyl chloride. And there was also the most recent transportation accident in Jordan where a tank of chlorine gas ruptured while being transported, where 13 people died and 250 people were injured, causing this to have a very adverse effect on public health. So the objective of my study was to determine if gut dysbiosis plays a significant role in the development of acute and chronic lung injury post-chlorine gas exposure. So I hypothesized that dysbiosis of the gut microbiome following exposure to chlorine gas would increase inflammation and inhibit lung healing, specifically in mice that underwent gut dysbiosis following 14 days of exposure. So the study was done using 40 adult C57BL6 mice, 20 of which were male and 20 of which were female. The C57BL6 is the most commonly used inbred strain of mice for research purposes, mainly used to model immunological conditions in mice such as this one. So these mice were exposed to chlorine gas at 500 parts per million for 15 minutes, where they were placed in an environmental chamber after being injected with buprenorphine and exposed to the gas. And additionally, the mice were sacrificed at various intervals post-chlorine gas exposure, 1 day, 7 day, and 14 day, where BALF, blood, and lung samples were collected from the mice. BALF is bronchoalveolar lavage fluid, where a catheter is inserted into the trachea of the mice and saline solution is instilled into the bronchioles. And this causes the lungs to swell and turn white, and the liquid is then collected. And lastly, stool samples of the mice were collected at different intervals, again, 1 day, 7 day, and 14 day post-gas exposure, and DNA extraction was performed from the stool samples. So we first did a pre-experiment to determine a safe amount to expose these mice to. And so they were all exposed at 500 parts per million for 3 different durations, 30 minutes, 20 minutes, and 15 minutes. And so with the 30 minutes, we saw that with the male mice, all of them ended up dying over 24 hours. So we decreased it to 20 minutes, where we saw all the male mice ended up dying over 1 day, but about 50% of the female population ended up surviving over 7 days. And since we needed them to survive over 14 days, we decided to decrease one last time to 15 minutes, where we saw more than 60% of both populations ended up surviving, and that's why we used 15 minutes to expose them. And so these 2 figures right here show the BALF protein levels in the mice before and after exposure. So we see that after exposure to chlorine gas, there was a significant increase in BALF protein levels, specifically in the males. And this was also seen in the BALF inflammatory cell count, where overall it increased after they were exposed to chlorine gas, but it was seen clearly there was an increase in the males than the females. And so this figure right here shows a genus level distribution of the gut microbiome that shows the different types of bacteria present in the males of the community. And we can see that good bacteria in the gut, such as lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, tended to decrease after they were exposed to chlorine gas, while harmful bacteria like bacteroids tended to increase, which shows that these mice underwent gut dysbiosis. And this was also seen in the females, except after day 7, they were able to recover from this gut dysbiosis. So in summary, compared to the females, the male mice had a higher mortality rate as seen from the preliminary results, and the BALF protein levels increased and were particularly high in males, as well as the total number of inflammatory cells, which shows that this was a sign of increasing lung injury and inflammation. And lastly, the chlorine gas-induced lung morbidity and mortality correlated with gut dysbiosis, particularly in males, as seen with the gut microbiome data. So I concluded that there was a correlation between gut dysbiosis and chlorine gas-induced inflammation, but I cannot yet conclude if gut dysbiosis was the cause of this inflammation. So in the future, I want to determine if the changes in the gut microbiome post-gas exposure contribute to the development of lung inflammation. And I would do this by administering a probiotic, specifically Lactobacillus rhamnosus, through an oral gavage to see if the probiotics help prevent lung injury and improve lung healing and survival in the mice. And another study I would love to do is to determine if the role of HO1 in mice affects their gut microbiome and lung injury. HO1 is the hemioxygenase 1 gene, which can help prevent inflammation, and some mice tend to overexpress this gene. So I want to see if this gene plays a role in their gut microbiome and how that would affect their lung healing and survival. I would like to thank my mentor, Dr. Agarwal from UAB, as well as the lab members, also the ASFA Math-Science faculty, specifically Ms. Thrash and Ms. Chin for being my faculty advisors, and Dr. Flanoy for all his support, and my family and friends. These are my references, and thank you for listening. Any questions? Yes.
So there was like quite a difference between how the male mice and the female mice sort of went through that. Did you see any like reasons for that? Like, was there any specific like differences between them that may have caused that?
So our lab and I were trying to figure that out, and we couldn't exactly find a reason why, but we assumed it might have something to do with their hormones, maybe. Any other questions? Yes, Dr. Kinnan.
Sanjana, did you look at the initial gut biomes between males and females to see whether or not there might be a difference and whether that might have affected anything?
Yeah, so right here, the blue bar graphs show the genus percentage before they were exposed to chlorine gas. And so that's why this is for the females. But like, for example, with the males, if you look at lactobacillus, you see that it was pretty like high, and then it ended up decreasing after they were exposed.
It'd be interesting to see the two graphs next to each other.
Yeah, it's just, it would be really tiny, that's why.
Yeah.
Hello everyone, my name is Arsalan Ahmed, and the title of my project is Predictive Personalized Drug Screening and Acute Myeloid Leukemia Study. So, let's start off with a little background information. We're going to start off with what is acute myeloid leukemia. Acute myeloid leukemia is a cancer in which your bone marrow produces an abundant amount of cells. Some interesting facts about it is that it's the most common acute leukemia in adults, and also its 5-year survival rate is 27% for adults. And another interesting thing about acute myeloid leukemia is that it gets worse really rapidly. So it's important that as soon as you identify if someone has this disease, that you treat it right away. And so here you see a representation of normal blood cells versus acute myeloid leukemia blood cell blasts. And so the next thing I want to talk about is precision medicine and drug treatments. So precision medicine is a field that focuses on giving personalized treatments to patients based off their specific genetic and molecular structure. It's basically saying that, me and you, we might have the same disease, and we might be treated by the same drug. However, the efficacy of that drug may vary between both of us. It may work really well for me, but not really well for you. So this whole field really focuses on making sure that everyone gets the right treatment. And so one thing about drug treatments, they're very limited, and the actual process of trying to develop drugs is a very lengthy process. There are several stages to it. And so it's important to consider the idea of repurposing existing drugs. And so one component of precision medicine is drug screening. So drug screening, the whole focus of it is trying to identify which drugs would be most effective for a particular patient's disease or cancer. And so here's a simplified process of that step, where the first thing you do is you take your patient sample, use LabWare to do your drug screening, and then you'll get your data analysis and results. So there are two problems with drug screening. The first problem is there's a lot of logistical delays. As you saw in my diagram below, it said here it takes around 5 weeks, it can take several weeks, several days. And like I mentioned before, like a condition like acute myeloid leukemia, a condition that gets worse really rapidly, it's important that we have our drug treatments as soon as possible. The second problem is availability. Drug screening clinics aren't implemented in every hospital yet, and they're still trying to be implemented, but their availability is also another problem. So my proposed alternative solution is model-based virtual screening. And so the idea behind it is I use a machine learning model to actually do the whole drug screening process. So I'll talk more about that. So my objective is to utilize a computational model trained on cancer cell lines, combining multi-cancer drug data features to predict the perturbations of an unknown drug on the specific cancer type, acute myeloid leukemia. So my methodology. Since this is a computational project, the first thing I need to do is I need to do my data preparation. So I got data from 3 different sources. The first source is I got my gene expression data from the Catalog of Somatic Mutations in Cancer database. And remember, in our traditional drug screening process, the first thing you do is you take in your patient sample. This sort of mimics that first step. The next thing is I got my disease and drug data from DrugBank and PubChem. And then I got my drug IC50 values from Genomics of Drug Sensitivity in Cancer. And so what drug IC50 values are is a metric of how effective a drug is on a particular disease or cancer. And what it really looks at specifically is how much concentration of a drug is needed to inhibit 50% of that cancer. And so from that, I had my combined data set with all my features. And the next thing is, before I train my model, is I needed to select a drug. So from DrugBank, again, I got a list of 173 FDA-approved drugs. And then I got a list of FDA-approved drugs for acute myeloid leukemia from cancer.gov, an external source. And I looked into those 2 data sets and see which drugs coincided within both of them. And that drug was venetoclax. And so a little background on venetoclax. It's a targeted therapeutic drug, so it focuses on inhibiting the growth of more cells. And then finally, I had to separate my data and then prepare my model. So I separated my data into 3 steps. The first is I looked at all the cancers except for acute myeloid leukemia and all of my 173 drugs. And then I looked at acute myeloid leukemia and my 172 drugs, where I take out 1 drug, and that drug was venetoclax. And using that data, 80% of that was used to train my model, and 20% of that data was used to test my model for drug screening. And then I did another test where I looked at acute myeloid leukemia and venetoclax, and then I tested for drug repurposing. And so everything would go into my model, and then my final output would be the natural log of IC50. I took the natural log of that value because I wanted to shorten the range of values. And so results. So this is my test for drug screening results. The regressor that I used for this experiment was a light gradient boosting machine. And so here's the output where it compares the real versus predicted IC50 values. And so you can see here my R-squared is 0.8271, which indicates a strong correlation. And my mean absolute error is 0.8839, which is minimal error, which means that there was less error in this experiment. However, in our second step, we did a test for drug repurposing. And so you can look at it visually and see that the real and predicted trend lines don't necessarily match up here. And our R-squared here is 0.2891, which is a weak correlation, and we have a lot of error here, mean absolute error of 2.2785. So from a quantitative perspective, our model didn't do too well. However, there's a qualitative aspect we can use to analyze this, and that's looking at the maximum IC50 threshold. And so what the maximum IC50 threshold is it looks at if anything is below this line, we can consider this drug treatment to be effective. So let's look specifically at patient sample 2. The real efficacy of this drug is in between -4 and -5. However, our predicted was a little bit higher, in between 0 and -1. However, we still say the same thing, that this would be an effective treatment. And so using that qualitative aspect of analysis, we had wrong predictions for our first and our last sample, which overall is an 88% accuracy, which was really good. And so, conclusion, this research highlights the potential of using drug features, disease features to actually, implement the whole drug discovery process to see, which drugs would be most effective for different diseases and cancers. However, there's more work that needs to be done to improve that, but this definitely is a step further into the whole precision medicine field. So future work, there's 3 things I'd like to do in the future. The first one is I want to incorporate more data. So as more data becomes available in these data sets, and I can also incorporate more data from other sources, then I can hopefully increase the accuracy of my model. And the second thing is, for this case study, I looked at acute myeloid leukemia. However, my model can be used to look at any different type of cancer or disease, and I can also look at any of those 173 drugs and how they would be affected on them. And then also, I mentioned that the light gradient boosting machine was my regressor for this, and obviously in the quantitative aspect it didn't do too well, so hopefully in the future I could use another regressor that would be able to more accurately predict that. And so my acknowledgements, I'd first like to thank my mentors, Dr. Jake Chen and Dr. Rahul Sharma from the UAB Informatics Institute, specifically the AI Med Lab. I'd also like to thank my faculty advisors, Ms. Chen, Dr. Flournoy, and Mr. Sproul. And then I'd also like to thank my family and friends. And so here are my references, and thank you very much. Questions? In the back. My motivation for this project? So I'm really interested in computer science, specifically its application to medicine, and this project was really a perfect fit for me because it combined both of them together. Any more questions? Okay.
Hello? Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Jesse Seidel and I'll be presenting my project on COVID-19 case prediction using machine learning. So machine learning is essentially the use of algorithms to mimic human learning, and we typically do this in order to make a prediction about something. There's 3 types: supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement learning. And we typically use machine learning because they can perform better than mathematical models. Machine learning is math, but when I say mathematical models, I mean mathematical models that are created by humans using their background knowledge. So for this project, I used long short-term memory models. These are a type of recurrent neural network that focus on long-term dependencies. Basically, they're very good for modeling data that occurs over a long period of time. This choice was based on a prior research on COVID-19 prediction previous to this project. Essentially, long short-term memory models saw a lot of success in predicting COVID-19 cases, so I decided to use on this and expand on it. So the CDC has a bunch of previous models that they've used. They've actually stopped using COVID-19 prediction models because they've been too inaccurate to use. However, the way that this would work is essentially they would have all these like schools or just like miscellaneous like locations, and they would have their own models. Then they would create like sort of a confidence interval based on these models. But as you can see, these models that the CDC had used, they differ wildly, and this can actually be a really big problem. So the way that the CDC has been making like decisions about the COVID-19 pandemic is they will make predictions about the number of cases, and if it's, for instance, really high, then they might start telling people to use masks, or they might encourage people to start vaccinating or go into lockdown. So if these are inaccurate, specifically too low, then that can be very dangerous to people. So for my project, I looked at 2 variables for my data. Of course, using past case data for the United States. This goes back for about 3 years, as well as deaths each day. So this could be roughly correlated to the number of cases each day, so I decided to use this to train the model. If you're wondering why not use other variables like vaccination data, well, the simple answer to that is it's kind of hard to get my hands on. The source I was using around here basically stopped recording the number of people vaccinated in the United States, so it was very difficult to find that information. As you can probably tell, this data is very noisy. So in order to feed this into a model, I basically scaled it down. I used something called robust scaler, which essentially uses the median and interquartile range of this data. It's essentially to reduce the effect that this outlier has on my model. I don't want my model to focus too much on this part. So my project goal was, of course, to use a long short-term memory model, utilizing a genetic optimizer, which we'll get to that in a second, to make an accurate prediction about the COVID-19 pandemic. So an accurate prediction was a cumulative difference less than 15% for a 28-day period. So the reason why I'm predicting 28 days into the future is because that's what the CDC has been doing before they stopped using their models. Essentially, they found that 28 days is enough time to implement health policy, so that's what they've decided. So there's what we call pre-processing that has to be done before we can feed the data into the model. Essentially, what has to be done here is we need to split the data set up into multiple different chunks to be fed into the model. So as you'll see here, what we do is we feed day 1, day 2, day 3, and then we make a prediction. This prediction is then compared to the actual, and then we measure an accuracy value. Then we shift over using day 2, day 3, day 4 to predict day 5. What you'll notice here is that we've dropped day 1, and the reason why we've done this is because it's not any use. What use is day 1 gonna be to predict day 500? It's not gonna really be that useful, so we've dropped it. Now, for the actual project, around 35 days were fed in to predict the 36th day. So you can imagine this, but just on a much larger scale. So this is the general model progression. So of course, data collection, which I talked about, data formatting, which was scaling the model using the median, as well as formatting the data, which I just showed you. This is what I would call normal model training. So essentially, we want to fit the curve of the data. So the machine learning model tries to fit the curve. It measures how far it is away using an accuracy measurement. Then it adjusts itself. Then I fed into something called PyGAD. So PyGAD is genetic algorithm for Python. Essentially what it does is it takes a model, creates around 10 different versions of that model, and then it selects the fittest version. So some of the models it creates will mutate, their weights on the neurons that they have will change, and it'll select the fittest version of all those models. That model will move on, and then 10 more will be created. So essentially we are modeling evolution in order to find the best model to predict COVID-19 cases. After this is done, I adjust hyperparameters and do this all again. So hyperparameters would be stuff like how many days do I feed in before predicting a day, how many neurons are in the layer for the machine learning model, how many models I create using PyGAD, stuff like that. So here are my results. So the orange here is the actual and the green is the prediction. These are known as one-day predictions, so it's just one day as a future. This blue right here is my 28-day prediction. So essentially how that works is the model makes a prediction and it feeds it back into itself. We can't make a prediction without those 35 days. So we have to make a prediction and it feeds back into itself and essentially drops the first day. So it kind of slides over. We call that a sliding window. And then over here, you will see, this was its prediction from January 29th. And so in the short term, it's still kind of fluctuating, but in the long term, the number of cases is decreasing. So for my conclusions, the model was able to capture the general trend of the COVID-19 dataset, which was really good. However, my percent cumulative difference for the 28-day prediction was a little bit higher than I wanted it to be. Lower is better. This was 15.35%. I would have liked anything below 15%, so the goal wasn't really met there. PyGAD, which was the genetic optimizer, did pretty much nothing to improve model accuracy. If you'll remember, I trained it using normal machine learning methods and then fed it into PyGAD. PyGAD doing nothing doesn't necessarily mean that PyGAD is useless or it doesn't work. It just means that the model hit its maximum potential before it was fed into PyGAD. It also could mean that PyGAD can't really deal with the complexity of this problem. It's not really known right now. So in my future work, I would like to use more COVID-19 related variables. So as I mentioned earlier, like number of people vaccinated. More data for what we call time series prediction, which is what this is, isn't necessarily better. Think of like the stock market. If you want to make predictions about the stock market, for tomorrow or even a month ahead, having data from 60 years ago isn't going to help you. So more data isn't necessarily better, but more variables can be. So I would like to actually apply this model to other diseases to test performance. Sort of the whole reason behind doing this project was the fact that when the COVID-19 pandemic started, there weren't a lot of really accurate models out there that could predict the number of cases. And this, of course, is really bad because if the CDC is basing their health decisions on these models and then they're super inaccurate, then it can lead to really uninformed health decisions. So I would like to apply this to different diseases just to see what it can do. And then, of course, testing different model types. So I had a lot of reason to believe that long short-term memory models would be some of the best. However, I didn't actually end up using any different model types. There could be different types that still perform better. I wouldn't know, so that'd be a good thing to test. So I'd like to give special thanks to my mentor, Dr. Gray at UA, and also Dr. Flournoy and Mr. Sproul for meeting with me, as well as my family and my friends helping me complete this project. Those are my references. Any questions? Okay.
Hello. I hope you have enjoyed all the speeches and all the projects. It's wonderful. Really like to thank everyone for coming out, and particularly I think I see quite a few people that I would like to recognize. ASFA President, Dr. Mitchell and Mrs. Mitchell, thank you for coming. I think we also have a foundation board, Mr. Jonathan Phillips, thank you for coming, and I hope you have enjoyed it. We also have quite a few ASFA alums, that whole row. One of you drove all the way down from Auburn. Ethan, thank you for coming. Thank you for the continued support. Now, can I have all my 13 seniors come on up? Come on, please. You do such a great job and hard work. Come on. Maybe parents would like to have a picture, group picture. Come. It's been a long day. It started at 7:30. If you want him to, sure. Dr. Flournoy, they are requesting your presence too. Come. I know. Okay, these are our 13 Math Science seniors, class of 2023. I want to make sure that you know how proud we are for all this hard work, so diligently working, and such great troopers to take all our suggestions, taking all the competitions, and still going for competition. Out of this group, we have 2 ISAF International Science and Engineering Fair finalists. Daniel Zhao, come on, step up. Yes. And also Joscelyn Peterson. Okay, thank you. And also, we also have 2 particularly very special troopers that have been going through Ramadan and without any water and stuff. And I really, really appreciate all the effort, both of you, Becca and Arnold. So, your chance to get a picture of the special group here before we dismiss for a nice reception outside. Are we good? Yeah. Good. Thank you, guys. And let's enjoy the reception. Thank you.